Have you ever wished you could just grasp the core ideas of something complicated without having to wade through all the details? Like absorb the key takeaways from a ton of information without getting bogged down.
Well, that's exactly what we try to do in our deep dives, and today we're going deep into a topic based on the materials you gave us. It's all about communication, specifically how to communicate effectively, and the art of preparing to speak. Super fascinating stuff.
Yeah, for sure. We're diving into the fundamentals of crafting a speech. We'll cover everything from the initial building blocks to those subtle details that can make or break a conversation. We'll also look at the amazing ways our brains make sense of communication and try to figure out the whole intricate dance of how we understand each other.
It's a pretty complex process when you think about it, but our goal today is to give you practical knowledge and insights that you can put to use right away. We want to help you become more confident and effective communicators in any situation, whether you're up on a stage, giving a presentation, or just having a casual conversation with a friend. So, ready to dive in? Let's start with how to build a strong message. Where do we even begin?
So, one of your sources, tests-of-oral-communication.pdf, says that designing a speech really boils down to three main things: research, organization, and outlining. It's like building a house. Research is like surveying the land and figuring out what you can build. Organization is like the blueprint, and outlining is the detailed plan for each room. If you skip any of these important steps, your final structure might not be as strong no matter how nicely you decorate later on. That would be the writing, editing, and presenting.
That's a great analogy. Makes it super clear. And speaking of research, the materials also highlight a few reliable sources. The internet, of course you have to be careful what you believe online, libraries, and conducting interviews. On the other hand, they warn against relying too much on personal blogs.
I can see why. Personal blogs can offer interesting points of view, but you don't always know if the information is accurate. They often don't go through the same fact-checking and editing process as more established sources. If you want trustworthy info, you've got to look for credibility.
Yep, definitely. Once you've got your information, you need to figure out how to use it well. That's where supporting material comes in. And the key takeaway here is that it's not just about filling time or being entertaining. It's about making your points clearer and helping your audience really understand what you're talking about.
Exactly. It's all about substance. Then, how you arrange all that info is super important too. The source talks about different organizational patterns, and one that comes to mind is time structure. When do you think that structure would be the most helpful?
Well, time structure is your best friend if you're explaining a process step by step. Like, imagine you're trying to explain how to use a new software program or walking someone through the stages of a project. It's also the perfect way to tell a story or describe a sequence of events in chronological order. The source also mentions other patterns like spatial, comparison, and topical.
Right. Spatial is when you're describing something based on how it's laid out physically. Comparison highlights similarities and differences between things, and topical is organizing your information around main themes or categories. Now, there were a couple of true or false points in the materials that address some common misconceptions. One that stuck out was that just because a website ends in raudals.com doesn't automatically make it a reliable source of information.
Oh yeah, that's so important these days with so much information online. That .com can be a little clue, but it's not a guarantee. You've always got to dig a bit deeper, check the author's background, look for any signs of bias, and see if other trustworthy sources back up the information. But on a positive note, the materials confirm that analogies, those comparisons that help explain unfamiliar things by relating them to something familiar, are really helpful for making complex ideas click.
Absolutely. And here's one that might surprise you. In an informative speech, your intro should only take up about 10% of your total time, not like a whopping 50%. Get to the point.
Yeah, time is precious when you're giving a speech. You don't want to bore your audience with a super long intro. And on the topic of preparation, if you're planning to interview someone for your speech, always get their permission to record before you show up. It's just respectful and the ethical thing to do. Don't leave it till the last minute.
Good point. So let's break down the essential parts of a good informative speech intro. The notes highlight 4 key elements. What are they?
All right, so first you got to grab your audience's attention. You can do this with a thought-provoking question or maybe a surprising statistic. Then you need to make it relevant to them. Why should they care about what you're going to say? After that, you've got to establish your credibility, let them know why you're qualified to talk about this, and finally, give them a preview of your main points, almost like a mental roadmap of your presentation.
Love the roadmap analogy. Makes sense. So when you're putting together the main part of your speech, what kind of supporting material should you be aiming for?
The notes give us some good pointers there. They recommend using opinions from experts in the field, verifiable facts, and statistics that can back up your claims with solid data. These are the ingredients for a credible and informative speech.
Okay, so we've covered research, structure, outlining, and supporting evidence. But why is it so important to have a clear organizational pattern? There's an essay question in one of the sources that really emphasized this point.
What's really interesting is how the source stresses that a clear structure is super important if you want your message to be logical, coherent, and easy for your audience to understand. Imagine trying to follow directions that are all over the place.
It's frustrating, right? A clear structure, like using a time sequence to explain a process or using a comparison to show similarities, gives your audience that framework they need to follow along and get your main points.
That makes total sense. So we've laid out the speech design process. Now, let's rewind to the very beginning, even before you start thinking about an outline, the initial speech preparation.
All right, so according to the comprehensive test on initial speech preparation, the very first thing you need to figure out is your purpose. Why are you giving this speech? Are you trying to inform, persuade, or entertain? This understanding becomes your guiding principle. It's interesting that the test doesn't say narrowing the topic is the starting point.
I see what you mean. You have to know why you're speaking before you can decide what to say. And if your goal is to inform, what's the main thing you're trying to do? Well, with an informative speech, your main goal is to help your audience understand something new. It's about shedding light on something they might not have known before. Clarity and knowledge sharing are key.
Gotcha. So once you have that purpose locked in, what comes next?
Next up is picking your topic, and this is where it gets crucial. You need to narrow that topic down to something you can actually cover in the time you have. For example, you can't effectively talk about the entire history of space exploration in just 10 minutes.
You'd barely scratch at the surface. Now, there's also something called the key in the speech design process. What exactly is that?
Think of the key as the central idea holding everything together. It's the common thread that runs through all your main points. It's a thing that unifies your speech and makes it feel like a cohesive whole.
That makes sense. And here are a few more true or false points to clear up some confusion. First, the real purpose of giving a speech is to share your unique understanding of a topic with your audience.
Exactly. It's about sharing your insights and knowledge. However, the initial brainstorming phase, where you generate ideas, shouldn't be super structured or logical. Let your ideas flow freely, explore different angles.
Absolutely. Free-flowing ideas are the best. And it's important to remember that informative speeches shouldn't be about your personal opinions or judgments. You're presenting information objectively, not giving your opinion.
Right. Objectivity is key in informative speeches. And when you're figuring out your goals, keep in mind that the specific goal statement you write down is mostly for you, the speaker, to stay focused. You don't have to share it word for word with the audience.
Makes sense. It's like your personal guide. And last but not least, when it comes to your audience, demographics like age and gender can give you some basic info, but that's not enough to truly connect with them. You have to understand what they already know, what they're interested in, and what they're hoping to get out of your presentation.
Yeah, demographics are just one piece of the puzzle. To really tailor your message and resonate with your audience, you need to go deeper and understand who they are and what matters to them. Now, let's take a minute to clear up the difference between informative and persuasive speeches. They can seem similar, but there's a key distinction.
Sure. We've talked about how informative speeches are all about boosting understanding. Persuasive speeches, on the other hand, aim to convince your audience to agree with your point of view or even to take action.
Exactly. Now, why is it so crucial to narrow down your topic, regardless of whether you're giving an informative or persuasive speech?
Well, it all comes down to being focused and clear. If your topic is too broad, you'll end up trying to cover too much ground, and your audience might miss the main message. Narrowing it down lets you delve deeper and have a greater impact.
The notes also give us some helpful criteria to consider when choosing a speech topic.
Oh yeah, those are really useful. First, your topic needs to fit your overall goal, whether that's to inform, persuade, or entertain. Second, it has to be something you can cover thoroughly in the time you have. Third, it should be relevant to your audience. And lastly, it's best if it's something that both you and your audience find interesting.
And what about audience analysis? How does taking the time to really understand your audience before you start writing help with the speech design process.
It's super important. When you understand your audience's knowledge level, their interests, and what they expect, you can tailor your content, your language, and your examples to make a stronger connection. This keeps them engaged and makes them more likely to understand and remember what you're saying.
That makes sense. The physical environment where you'll be speaking is important too. What are some practical things a speaker should keep in mind?
The notes mention thinking about the room layout, if there's enough seating, what equipment you might need, like a microphone or projector, where to place any visuals, and even the time of day, which can affect the audience's energy levels and focus. All those things can impact how well your message is received.
Absolutely. And just to sum up, the entire speech design process really guides you from that initial big picture purpose all the way to how you'll deliver your speech and whether you'll use any visuals. It's a systematic process that needs careful attention at each stage.
For sure. And don't forget, your audience is at the heart of it all. Those notes really drive home how important that initial analysis is and how it shapes every choice you make. For instance, if you know your audience doesn't know much about your topic, you'll need to use simple language and provide more background information.
Okay, we've covered prepping and designing speeches in depth, but what about those everyday conversations we have? Your sources also delve into that. Let's start with a simple definition.
Great idea. According to the test on the heart of communication, a conversation is basically a spontaneous back and forth exchange between people. It's not scripted, it just flows naturally in the moment.
And we all know conversations don't always go smoothly. The notes highlight a few reasons why they can get derailed.
Like, sometimes the context isn't right. Maybe you're trying to have a serious talk when the timing is bad. Then there are the relationships involved. Maybe there's tension or a power imbalance. And of course, the structure of the conversation matters. If the purpose isn't clear to everyone, it can lead to confusion. And then there's behavior. Misinterpreting someone's body language, for example, can cause misunderstandings. What I found interesting is that the test specifically says memorization is not a reason conversations go wrong, which makes sense because they're supposed to be spontaneous.
Right. It's when we try to make a conversation follow a strict script that it feels awkward and unnatural. The sources also talk about the different power dynamics that can come into play.
Yes. Drawing on the work of John French and Bertram Raven, they mention reward power, expert power, and legitimate power. Reward power is the ability to offer incentives or rewards. Expert power comes from having specific knowledge or skills. And legitimate power is based on holding a formal position or title. It's interesting that informational power, while influential, isn't included here as one of the main power bases.
It's true, those power dynamics can definitely affect how a conversation goes and who has more sway. And just like a speech has a beginning, middle, and end, so does a conversation, though in a more fluid way.
That's a good point. The notes break it down into 3 stages: the opening, the body, and the closing. In the opening, you start the conversation. The body is the main part, where you exchange information and ideas, and the closing is where you signal that the conversation is wrapping up.
Just like with prepping a speech, there are things you can do to make your conversations better. The notes suggest a few things. Be clear about what you want to achieve in the conversation, manage your time well so it doesn't drag on or end too abruptly, and find common ground to build rapport. It also points out that trying to avoid any structure at all isn't really good strategy. Having some sense of direction can make the conversation more productive and satisfying.
There were also a few true or false statements that shed some light on conversations. One that stood out was that the relationship you have with the other person definitely sets boundaries for what you can talk about and how you talk about it.
That's just the nature of how we interact with
Of
people.
course.
You're going to have different conversations with a close friend than you would with someone you barely know. However, the notes clarify that nonverbal messages are always happening, even when you're not speaking. Your body language is constantly communicating something.
That's so true. We're always sending signals, whether we realize it or not. And while being a good speaker is important, a good conversation isn't just about talking, it's also about listening.
Exactly. Listening carefully to what the other person is saying is just as important as expressing yourself clearly. And finally, the notes emphasize how things like status, power, your role in the relationship, and whether you like the other person all affect how comfortable you feel in the conversation and how much personal space you need.
That makes a lot of sense. To elaborate a bit more on those 3 stages of conversation, the opening sets the tone and gets things started. The body is where the real exchange happens. It's about sharing information, opinions, and ideas. Then, the closing signals that the conversation is coming to a natural end.
The notes also give us some real-life examples of where conversations can go wrong, relating back to those four main areas we talked about earlier. Not having enough time for a meaningful conversation is a context issue. Feeling like you're in a lower status position can affect how confident you feel and how much you participate, which is about the relationship. Misunderstanding the purpose of the conversation can lead to frustration and people talking past each other, which is a structure problem. And then misinterpreting someone's body language can lead to misunderstandings or even arguments, which falls under behavior.
Those are great examples. The materials also talk about how our brains work during conversations, mentioning first stage and second stage thinking.
Right. First stage thinking is that immediate gut reaction. Your brain quickly categorizes things based on your existing mental models. Second stage thinking is more deliberate and involves actively processing the language and ideas to achieve a goal within the conversation.
And to circle back to those territorial relationships, the four main factors are status, power, role, and liking. Status is about perceived social standing or rank. Power is about how much influence one person has over another. Role refers to expected behaviors based on the type of relationship. And liking is simply how much you like the other person.
And why is interpreting nonverbal communication so tricky? Why do we often misunderstand each other's body language? The notes give us a few reasons.
Well, for one, nonverbal cues can be ambiguous. A crossed arm could mean someone's feeling defensive, but it could also just mean they're cold. Also, as we mentioned earlier, body language is continuous, so it's hard to control. Plus, we're constantly bombarded with tons of nonverbal signals at once. And to make things even more complicated, cultural differences can make a huge difference. A gesture that's perfectly normal in one culture could be offensive in another.
That's true. It's a lot to keep track of. The notes also include some really interesting critical thinking questions that encourage you to reflect on what makes a conversation enjoyable or challenging for you.
Yeah, they really make you think. They ask you to think about how you'd politely end a long phone call or deal with someone who talks too much. They also prompt you to think about your own strengths and weaknesses as a communicator and to consider why it can be so hard to really listen sometimes. They even touch on how emotions play a big role in our conversations.
They really get you thinking about how you communicate. Now, let's move on to how we actually make sense of each other when we communicate. Your sources offer some interesting models to help us understand this process.
For sure, the comprehensive test, understanding how we understand, introduces the classic model of communication, which was developed by Claude Shannon and Warren Weaver.
Right. And one of the basic assumptions of this model is that what you intend to communicate and how it's actually understood might not always be the same. You might have a clear idea in your mind, but the way you express it might not come across perfectly to the other person.
That's a really important point. The notes also talk about a more modern model, highlighting 5 key contexts that affect how we understand each other.
Okay, let's go through them. The 5 contexts are psychological, relational, environmental, situational, and cultural. The psychological context refers to your individual needs, values, and beliefs, which all play a part in how you communicate. The relational context is all about how you define your relationship with the other person. Are they a friend, a colleague, a stranger? The situational context refers to the social norms and expectations that come with a specific situation. The environmental context is about the physical surroundings, the location, temperature, noise level, and so on. And the cultural context includes all those learned behaviors and shared understandings that come from your cultural background. It's interesting that technology, while it clearly affects communication today, isn't listed as a separate context in this model, even though it overlaps with many of them.
Yeah, that is interesting. And the notes mention some recent research suggesting that the main reason we communicate is to build and maintain relationships.
That seems pretty intuitive, right? Communication isn't just about exchanging information, it's a fundamental way we connect as humans. The notes also go into detail about how our brains process information during communication, specifically bottom-up and top-down processing.
Okay, so bottom-up processing is how our brains first take in raw sensory information, shapes, colors, sounds, all the data coming in through our senses.
Exactly. And top-down processing is how our brains then organize that raw data into meaningful patterns, using our existing knowledge, experiences, and expectations. It's like these two processes are working together to help us understand the world around us.
Going back to the classic model, the notes confirm that it assumes communication is always intentional. You're consciously trying to send a message.
But newer models recognize that we're communicating all the time, even without realizing it, through our actions, body language, and even when we're silent. And the notes also emphasize how top-down processing is the way our brains organize info into patterns.
Another key principle is that communication never happens in a vacuum. It's always influenced by the context.
Totally. The specific situation, your relationship with the other person, your cultural backgrounds, these all shape how you communicate and how your message is understood. But there's an important point made in the notes. Ideas aren't fixed. They change and evolve as we interact and learn new things.
It's true, ideas are dynamic. And building rapport with someone goes beyond just words. It's about nonverbal cues, empathy, and understanding each other. It's a deeper connection.
Absolutely. The classic model, while foundational, has been criticized for how it portrays the receiver of the message. What's the main issue there?
Well, the biggest criticism is that it makes the receiver seem passive, like they're just absorbing whatever the sender says. It doesn't really account for how the receiver interprets the message through their own lens, using their own experiences and understanding.
Which brings us back to the interplay of bottom-up and top-down processing. How do these two systems work together when we're trying to understand what someone is communicating?
They're in constant communication. Bottom-up processing provides the raw sensory data, while top-down processing tries to make sense of it by matching it to what we already know and expect. It's how we interpret and make meaning of the world around us.
Let's dig a bit deeper into those 5 contexts we talked about earlier. The psychological context includes your individual needs, desires, values, and beliefs, all of which affect how you communicate. The relational context focuses on how you define your relationship with the other person.
The situational context is about the social norms and expectations of a particular situation. The environmental context is about the physical setting. And the cultural context is about the learned behaviors and values that come from your cultural background.
And the notes suggest that 3 levels of understanding emerge from communication. What are they?
The first level is the relationship level, which is about building rapport connection. Then there's the information level, where shared meaning and understanding happen. And finally, there's the action level, where your communication influences the other person's thoughts or actions.
That's a good way to look at it. Understanding how our communication impacts the other person's mental model, how they view the world, is key to having effective conversations. If you can anticipate how they might understand your message based on their experiences, you can adjust your communication to be more clear and impactful.
The notes even have a scenario about giving a presentation, asking you to think about a topic, the context involved, and the 3 levels of understanding you'd want to achieve with your audience. It's a great way to put these ideas into practice.
They also have a short vignette with a waiter and someone who forgot their reading glasses. What do you think we can infer from that interaction? And where might we see a scene like that?
The obvious inference is that the person is struggling to read the menu without their glasses. You might see that kind of scene in a story to highlight a character's vulnerability, or in a textbook as an example of nonverbal cues and how we make inferences.
That makes sense. Now, let's switch gears to the broader communication process. Your sources really emphasize how important communication is in general.
It really is fundamental. Good communication is essential for strong relationships, getting our needs met, negotiating, doing business, and just functioning in the world. It helps us achieve positive outcomes, feel more confident, and build connections.
So what are the essential parts of this communication process?
The notes list several. The communicators, the people involved, the messages, what's being exchanged, the channel, how the message travels, the circumstances, the overall context, feedback, the response to the message, and noise. Anything that interferes with communication.
And what are some good questions to ask yourself if you're trying to figure out why a communication went wrong?
The notes suggest reflecting on your own actions, the other person's behavior, the communication channel you used, how you worded your message, and whether there was any noise interfering.
That's a great checklist to have. Let's unpack some of those components. Remember that communicators are doing more than just sending or receiving. They're doing both at the same time, even in a simple conversation.
Exactly. It's a two-way street. And the process of putting your thoughts into words and nonverbal cues is called encoding. Decoding is what the receiver does when they try to understand your message.
And those nonverbal messages we talked about are actions or cues that communicate without using words. The notes have some great examples. Your gestures, your tone of voice, what you're wearing, even the car you drive can all send a message.
The channel is just the way your message gets across, like a face-to-face chat, an email, a phone call, a text, or even a social media post.
Circumstances encompass the whole context, including the physical setting, the social situation, and each person's background, attitudes, and beliefs.
Feedback is how you know whether your message was understood, and it can be verbal or nonverbal.
And noise, as we mentioned earlier, is anything that gets in the way of the message. The notes talk about three types: physical noise, like loud sounds; personal noise, like your own biases; and semantic noise, like misunderstandings about the language used.
The notes also categorize communication into four types based on how many people are involved.
Right. Interpersonal communication is that internal dialogue you have with yourself, your thoughts, and self-talk.
Then there's interpersonal, which happens between two people. Think of one-on-one conversations.
Small group communication is when a small group of people, usually 3 to 20, interact with a common purpose, like in a team meeting or a study group.
And public communication is when one person delivers a message to a larger audience, like a presentation or speech.
So with all these different parts and types of communication, what would you say is the most important skill for being a good communicator?
I'd say adaptability is key. Being able to adjust your communication style and approach to fit different situations and people is super important. It helps you connect with people and get your message across effectively.
Couldn't agree more. The notes also have some thought-provoking questions that make you think about the whole communication process. They ask you to think about a time you might have picked the wrong communication channel and what happened. They also encourage you to think about what it means when we rely too much on technology to communicate and avoid face-to-face interaction.
They definitely make you stop and reflect on your own habits. And the notes even offer suggestions about which channels are best for different situations. Like if you're sharing bad news, it's best to do it in person.
For sure. And they suggest some practical activities too, like keeping track of your own interactions throughout the day and thinking about your experiences with public speaking. It's a good way to apply these ideas to real life.
So, in this deep dive, we've explored a lot from how to prepare for a speech and navigate everyday conversations to different models of communication and the overall communication process. It's been pretty comprehensive.
Our goal, as always, has been to take the in-depth sources you provided and pull out the most valuable nuggets of wisdom to help you become a better communicator.
And on that note, here's a final thought for you to ponder. Thinking about what we've discussed today, is there any part of communication that you're now super curious about or want to try using in your own life?
We hope this deep dive has laid a solid foundation for you. We hope it inspired you to learn more and helps you communicate more effectively and meaningfully in the future.